Welcome to the Accessible Learning Experience, where we help you turn learning barriers into learning opportunities. On this three-part episode, AIM Center Director Cynthia Curry chats with CAST founders David Rose and Skip Stahl as they discuss the rich history of accessibility at CAST. In part 1, David focuses on the early years of accessibility at CAST and the work that laid the foundation for a number of innovations that continue to shape the field of education 4 decades later. This includes the development of the earliest electronic books to include accessibility supports, which were based on the lessons learned from CAST's early work with learners with disabilities and the appropriately named Pioneers program, and the creation of the award-winning and first of its kind Bobby Web Accessibility Checker. You'll also hear David explain how a meeting with Ron Mace, who coined the term universal design, led to the creation of universal design in education, or what we now know as universal design for learning. Here's Cynthia to start off our conversation with David and Skip.
David and Skip, thank you for this opportunity to discuss how accessibility for learners with disabilities shaped CAST as an organization. I'm so excited to dig into this history. When people talk about CAST today, it's almost always in the context of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, which is a research to practice framework based on the science behind how people learn. But CAST actually originated from research and development of technology products that were intentionally designed to be accessible for learners with disabilities. So UDL really evolved from CAST's application of accessibility to the design of learning technology products. David, tell us about some of those early products and why accessibility for learners with disabilities was so foundational to CAST's approach to design and development.
Well, I think it's important to understand how we actually began anything. We were 2 clinics, really, at North Shore Children's Hospital. One was called the Medical and Educational Evaluation Clinic, and it was primarily students who had learning disabilities, emotional difficulties, and things like that. And the clinicians were neuropsychologists and special educators, and our job was to evaluate kids who were having learning problems in school and make recommendations for them. Certainly we weren't developing any products or any new ideas or anything. We were just evaluating children who were having trouble in school. The other clinic, the DEC, Developmental Evaluation Clinic, was for students who were much more, as we used to say, severely involved in some way. That is, they had what we used to call mental retardation, they had physical, sensory disabilities, and often multiple disabilities. So these required much broader evaluation. And so in that clinic, instead of neuropsychologists, although there was a neuropsychologist or 2 always present, they would have physical therapists and occupational therapists and language therapists and so on, and even a psychiatrist and specialists in cognitive disabilities and so on. They were multidisciplinary evaluations. These kids had enough problems in school that they were usually not in traditional schools at all. Most of them weren't. And the issues were, as we would now say, accessibility. They didn't have accessibility to school itself. And so it was the blending of those 2 clinics, actually, that was foundational, which is people who are primarily interested in the learning aspects and people who are primarily interested in a much broader set of accessibility requirements. And that involved such things that we didn't necessarily call accessibility at the time, but one of our earliest clinicians, Katie Barnes, her main focus was on accessibility within wheelchairs. How do you position, she called it the positioning lab, how do you position kids with supports, physical supports, so that they can operate their wheelchair, for example, electric wheelchair. Without being positioned correctly, the kids were not able to even be mobile in the chairs that they had. And so there's a whole clinic just on how do we make sure kids have access to their wheelchair. And the same was true for OT, except it was like, in some cases, how do kids get access to a pencil? They had dysgraphia or physical disabilities of various kinds, and a traditional tool like a pencil was really hard for them to use. So people like Karen Heffler, which was one of the early clinicians, was an OT, and she would work on how to adapt pencils and put things on them, and I can't even remember how it was done, so the kids could actually use a pencil. And similarly, Lynn Chambers and others who were speech pathologists were evaluating how can we have kids be able to speak in some way who were nonverbal. And she was using were called augmentative communication devices. They were not computers, but they were things that had recordings of speech, and the kids would press buttons if they could press buttons. And her job was to figure out how to help kids so that they could make utterances of various kinds, usually pre-recorded, by pressing a button. And often it would be all of the above. That is, we'd have to make a switch so that a kid could use an augmentative communication device, and so on. And kids might be blind, and we'd have to work on how do we do that. So accessibility was really core to that work. And it was out of that work that we began to have to make things. The LD type clinic wasn't making anything, but we had to make switches, for example. And I'm going to use one of our favorite examples, a kid named Matthew, who was wanting to go to preschool. His parents wanted to go to preschool. He was very physically disabled by a brainstem stroke, so he couldn't walk or talk or do any of those things. All he could do was move his chin, and that was pretty much it. So Katie Barnes had to fix a positioning system so that he could be okay in a wheelchair and that his chin was available for use. But then I think, Skip, was it Charlie Dunn that helped us literally make a switch that would go under his chin? And that was, as far as I recall, the first time we ever made anything. And that was the first time Matthew was able to actually signal through any devices. And then with all these other things, we were able to start to make him be able to talk, and through augmentative communication devices and so on, and to be able to even write when computers came along, always using his switch. And Skip will remember this, but we first taught him to use Morse code because we didn't know how was he supposed to communicate. So he would do Morse code with his chin. And I remember one of the most dramatic moments in CAST history was when our first outside funder was visiting. Matthew was in the lab working with Ann Meyer, who was primarily working with him around how to get this switch so it would work so he could do things, including drive his wheelchair, by the way, with his chin. He's sitting, and I can't remember what device he was even using. For the first time, he typed out his name, and our funder just happened to be there. And then he typed out, "This is the best day of my life." And it was just like, we all just like fell apart. And that's when we realized we need to do this in a more serious way, I think, more than anything. And so we began working with individual kids because we needed to find out what we needed to do. And we called the first set of kids pioneers. They were just kids who were going to pioneer for us. What is the kind of access that we need to work on? Again, with a primary focus, though, driven by the learning people on in school. You know, it wasn't just everything. But Matthew had to drive his wheelchair to get to school, so that counted for us. And so these things were never that separate. Matthew had to drive his wheelchair, had to be positioned well, he had to have a Morse code to be able to talk. All these things were part of him being in school. So we had these pioneers, and Skip had one. Skip, tell about yours.
Yeah, I worked with a young man named Rob who had cerebral palsy. He was quite verbal, but had very limited motor control, tiny amount of fine motor control in fingers, enough to be able to manipulate a joystick on a wheelchair, but really not use a keyboard effectively. And because he was so verbal, he was frustrated that he was unable to write effectively in any way. And so we got interested in what was then an emerging capability in desktop computers, which was essentially voice recognition. And by I mean emerging was the earlier systems were costing about $30,000 to actually have a system that would allow you to speak and have text appear on a computer screen. And Rob and I spent probably 2 years working with a variety of systems as they would evolve. We've got some donations, we got some funding to purchase these equipment to work with Rob, and he got to be quite adroit and skilled at using the systems, but also was able to give considerable feedback and perspective to the developers of some of these systems, some of whom were in the Boston area. which helped them shape their subsequent products as they move forward. Those systems were incredibly clunky. I mean, certainly compared today to similar systems that exist on your cell phone or on your desktop computer and are simply built in to the operating system. These were extensive add-ons, and keep in mind that when this started, the hard drive capabilities and the processing speed were both quite limited. So it was often a frustrating circumstance to train these new systems and make sure you save the file and the voice file and that people could use them only in a certain controlled environment. But as we began to work through this, Rob would his perseverance and patience in working with this system ultimately paid off, and he became quite skilled at writing using his voice to control the text that appeared on the computer screen.
So all of that was, again, we weren't developing products. It was not our intent or philosophy even. We were just trying to use whatever we could. And so sometimes we'd had to adapt things and remodel them, but it was taking mostly finding what was out there in the world and making it useful to give kids better access to things like learning in school. I'll just mention a guy I worked with who had cognitive disabilities, and he was an adult and a farmer, worked on his parents' farm. And the biggest thing for him was to know the weather each day and what was going to happen all day so that he could plan his day. And so we just taught him how to use a computer, which was, just to remind you, the computers then were, the good ones were 64K total memory. The ones we had in the lab were 32K, so you can picture there wasn't a lot you could do with them. Anyway, as things would come out and get better, we were able to teach him how to use the computer to find out what the weather was, which was just calling in. And then he became a weather reporter for the local news station because he was so good at tracking the weather and knowing what it was that he would call in and say to the weather channel, it's 94 degrees here in my town and so on. So he was long past schooling, but it was an educational thing that we were doing, and it was great. Anyway, each of these things taught us a lot. These were our pioneers to get us started. The big revolution happened, in my judgment, was when Apple came out with HyperCard. Because up to then, we were again just taking things with these tiny little computers and doing the best we could. And when HyperCard came out, most of you won't know what that is. HyperCard was a very simple visual programming language. So we didn't have to, know any of the deep programming languages, but very visual in the way that Apple can design. And we realized that we could make things. And that changed our view of what a lot of things that we could do. And among many others, we began to develop for the first time, and the first time anybody had ever seen one, an electronic book that was done in HyperCard, that the pages could be turned by Skip's guy, by my guy, by all of them. But the important first step was to get access to the book itself. And it's hard to remember how inaccessible books were to all of our pioneers, really. And so we just really wanted something they could all use. And so Matthew could turn the pages with its switch. That was its, our first goal was to just be able to have Matthew be able to turn pages, which he couldn't do in a print book. So once we did that, we started to realize, well, now this book can talk itself aloud, which people hadn't done. And we started to think, well, what are the other things that we can build into books that would suit all of our pioneers and all of the kids we were seeing in our clinic? So that's how it really began, almost literally, with how do we position a kid physically so that they can use these powerful tools rather than books and pencils. But once we did that, it's then, wow, what are all the other access features that we can use for kids who have reading difficulties or visual difficulties or cognitive difficulties? But it really, I think it's important, because people don't realize it, that we really began with very much the physical and sensory accessibility issues, because they were huge barriers. And the others we learned to do once we'd done that, once we had electronic books, we could start to put vocabulary support. We could start to put supports in for kids who had dyslexia. But for us, it was all the same thing. It was just like, how do we get Matthew supported enough to be able to use a computer? Then how do we get an LD kid supported enough that they can do Shakespeare? So that was the avenue by which we created actually our first products, unquote. And I think I picture the first really successful one, Skip, as Gateway Stories. Does that make sense to you? We'd done a few prototypes, and then we finally made storybooks. We took classic stories and made them in HyperCard. So Matthew could use it, Skip's Pine, all of them could use it. And we went to Don Johnston, a publisher at the time, showed it to him, and he brought it out as the first time most anybody had seen something that looked like an accessible book. And that was our first product. And we went on from there to just keep developing. What are the ways in which we can make better and better books? Books that were, as we will talk about it, universally designed. At the time, we had no language for that. We just knew we wanted books that were more accessible for all of our students. So that's how we got to our first product. Once we had an example of what we called an accessible book, we were able to show it around a bit. In the process of doing that, we also began to really embed more supports, a much broader set of supports. And we ended up showing it at a local publisher. I won't use their name for the moment. And nobody, I just want to be clear, no one had seen electronic books at this time. Seems incredible, but they just weren't a thing. And in fact, later when we showed them and they got interested, they said, the president of the company said, but no schools have computers. You know, where would you use these? Which just shows you what the time was. Anyway, so we showed this publishing group a sort of enhanced version of Gateway Stories that just did more for kids with learning disabilities, early reading problems, and so on. And the editors loved it. Thought, this is fabulous. And in particular, the editor-in-chief of the children's publishing. And we thought, wow, we've struck gold here. You know, somebody that really is in the big world has seen this and seen its potential for bringing it out not to kids who come into clinics who have disabilities, but as a normal product. We weren't showing it. They didn't know anything about disability. We weren't showing it about disability. Just a everyday reading electronic book program that would help kids learn to read. And anyway, she loved it, said she loved it. 2 weeks later, we don't hear a word. And we find out that she has left the company. And we're like, what? We just finally got somewhere. She's left the company. And we didn't hear a word from her for a long time. Until 6 months later, we get a call. And the head of technology for Scholastic is on the phone. And he says, I've been told to get in touch with you. And it was clear he did not want to talk to us. But my boss says that you're doing something there that we should see. So how can I see it? And it was that tone of voice, literally like, you know, this is going to be a wasted day talking about kids with disabilities. But anyway, so we did the show and tell. Actually, we met him at a conference and did it. And he went, this is cool. Okay, I get it. This is cool. And it began a relationship with Scholastic where they were, for the first time, looking at this as a whole classroom solution, not something made for kids with disabilities. And Marjorie Mayer was the head. She was the head of, I don't remember what she was called then, but curriculum development at Scholastic. She had just moved, is all that had happened to Scholastic. And she brought us with her, essentially, but we didn't know that. It took her a while to get started. And anyway, it took about a year to develop it, but with serious developers and people that made it much better. And they put out 64 books on the very first run. And it became the product that was called WiggleWorks, which we would have never named it. But WiggleWorks ultimately sold $40 million worth. So this was completely different scale. And so this was huge. It won all kinds of awards, and it was a landmark product in many ways. And it was a huge commercial success and essentially launched Scholastic into the electronic business, of which we helped them on a number of products. And one of the products that we helped them, Read 180, sold $1 billion of product. So this little kind of gateway sort of gave a gateway for us to get into mainstream changes in a huge publishing house, gave us a credibility to the rest of the world that allow us to begin to consult to many of the major publishing houses about what's their future in digital publishing. Now, there's one last thing I'll say, and that is, when we were doing this, we had no word for it. We were just making these accessible books, and they taught in the in the innards of them was about teaching, not just looking at things, but was still no word for it. And on our board was an architect, and she sees the early versions of WiggleWorks, and she goes, "Wow, you know what? I think what you're doing is universal design in education." Because remember, universal design began in architecture. So she knew about it from her field. And it was only at that moment of seeing it that she went, "I think this is what you'd call universal design." And she said, "You know what? Ron Mace, the founder of the whole universal design movement, is coming to Boston, next month for a big conference for architects. Why don't you come with me to the conference?" So she brought me. And it was down at the Heinz Center here in Boston. And she finds him, in the big hall there, and she brings me up to Ron Mace. This architect doesn't know anything about education. I don't know anything about architecture. But she makes the introduction. She explains, and I show him some things, some pictures or whatever. And he said, "You're right. This is universal design in education. It's fabulous." And that gave us a word to use. We'd never heard of universal design. And Ann Meyer really came up with universal design for learning, because we thought universal design in education didn't work. But we actually met Ron Mace, and he was so welcoming and kind of included us in this community. And it gave us a name and a new way to think, that what we were doing was universal design. And we were specifically doing universal design for learning. WiggleWorks was sort of a first iteration of that, and then everything after that, all of our work essentially was about universal design for learning. But I just want to stress that that included everything from Matthew being positioned well in his chair all the way through, augmentative communication and through the various assistive technologies, and all of those were a key part of providing that universal design. It wasn't separate for us. That was its roots. We learned how to do access first, and we learned how to do learning on top of that. But first was to create access, then do the learning stuff in something like WiggleWorks. And that was how it all started for us.
What a seminal moment to capture in the history of accessibility at CAST and the origin of UDL. David, thank you so much for that story. And CAST contributions to the design of the earliest accessible technologies actually extended beyond learning tools. Tell us about Bobby.
Bobby was, like WiggleWorks, a really big hit. And it came, and I'm very sorry that Chuck Hitchcock is not able to join us today, but he came to us from a consortium of schools that he was working with, and he was consulting a little bit to Apple. So he knew about Apple and he knew about schools. And he was the first hire we made where it seemed like somebody who really knew what they were doing. We always felt like we're just figuring this out and trying and so on. And Chuck had actually been in schools and worked with Apple Computer. And he was a key transformational figure for CAST. And so he became in charge of our technology because he knew more about it than any of the rest of us did. And after we had some success with things like digital books and WiggleWorks and so on, we realized that the target we needed to get to was the web itself, and that kids were going to be using the web, and it was inaccessible. And there were people who were working on, telling people how to make their websites more accessible and stuff. But people couldn't people who were making websites were not going to seminars on accessibility. They, it just wasn't in their interest set. So and mostly Chuck and a very young programmer that came to work with us, Josh Krieger, began to think about how do we help web designers so that they will make it automatically, like WiggleWorks was, so that it had accessibility built in to your website. And again, we knew that people were not going to pay money and go to workshops on how to make their brand new websites accessible. So they began the idea of, let's give them a checker. Let's give them a way to just quickly find out, have we done it? What's the thing to do? And so they did this really, Josh was a brilliant young guy, and Chuck had the overview of what was really needed. And they made this little program which would assess your website. Say, here's a problem. And when I say that, just means this picture doesn't have a description. So it's not accessible to a person with visual problems. Or this video has no captions. And it would just check it and give you a nice little report. And we called it Bobby because it was supposed to be, actually most people don't know that, why it's called Bobby, but it was called Bobby because it was meant to be a friendly English policeman. And that was its picture, just a friendly guy, no guns, but it was someone that would help you get across the street. So it was named Bobby, and Bobby took off because it made it easy enough for people to just check. Have I done things so that this is an accessible website? And it became supported by big-time companies, IBM, Mitsubishi, yeah. So first time we'd ever had relationships with real commercial companies who gave us literally, $100,000 each just to say we're sponsors and have their name be on it. Bobby, brought to you by IBM, Mitsubishi, whatever. And that was a big breakthrough for us in terms of understanding how the commercial world works, understanding how they could be our partners, and how they could get invested in the work. And Bobby won all kinds of prizes. Chuck was honored with a Computer World, Smithsonian. By the way, Skip, I just looked it up. When Chuck got that award, you know who else got an award that year? Jeff Bezos. Chuck got an award the same year that Jeff Bezos did. And it was fabulous. Anyway, so Bobby was a step toward out of the books world and into the whole internet world for us, and also into a much larger world of how the economy really works. It really was, it just was a time when we felt like, wow, we can do things that are important here. It gave us the oomph to be able to talk to the world of policy, the world of big, institutional change and stuff. Having had the success of Bobby gave us confidence, and as you know, we're very concerned about kids' emotional development and stuff, and we were kids. And to have something go well and be out there in the world and changing the world really gave us a confidence that allowed us to do some other things. Were great. By the way, Bobby was ultimately bought by several other companies, including IBM itself. So Bobby became central to the way IBM did accessibility.
Thanks, David. I think that's the story of Bobby, as well as WiggleWorks and going back to Gateway Stories, all could be part of a case story of how passion drives innovation and how it really should drive commercialization. And really, what a gift to capture that the sequence of the early events at CAST.
Tune in for part 2, where Skip discusses how CAST became more involved in the world of policy in order to have a broader impact in the world of education. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Accessible Learning Experience, brought to you by the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at CAST. You can find us on the web at aem.cast.org. There you'll find show notes with links to all of the resources mentioned on each episode. Thanks again for listening, and remember, accessibility is everyone's responsibility. The contents of this podcast were developed under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.